Okay, so I'm going to, first of all, speak slower than Frank. And
That's not necessary.
first, I want to also thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. I just want to tell you all I'm from Canada. It's approximately 2:30 in the morning. So if I don't make a lot of sense, I'm giving you one rationale. So here are some of my disclosures of interest. And what I'm going to try to do in the next 20 minutes or so is sort of give you a personal journey and sort of an epiphany. How did I become interested in all of this? I'm going to talk to you about the Hong Kong Manifesto and probably take some of Frank's points a little bit further and discuss the issues around implementation. So one of the first pieces of research that I got involved in was really an issue around, do we have enough people in a randomized trial to declare, to have the ability to declare that treatment A is superior to treatment B? Or are we committing what we call a type 2 error, and the study is too small, it's unable to declare that difference, it doesn't have the power? And what we saw early on, and now 25 years ago from the Peer Review Congress, is actually studies were grossly underpowered. And if we sort of move forward to a paper in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, what we can see here is that actually statistical power has not improved over time if you sort of look at reports of randomized trials over time. Although if you do look at the if you sort of look at, well, it doesn't work. But they do suggest that, power is increased over time. But I think it's really highly problematic because it's probably less than 10%. So I'm not impressed as a researcher, and I think that in terms of research integrity, we're not really helping patients here whatsoever. I also spend quite a bit of my time doing systematic reviews. And one of the things we do in systematic reviews is we actually look at, in a sense, the risk of bias, or we could today call it quality, of the included studies. And so when you look at something like this, you like to see lots of green. When you see red, it's not good, it's bad. And so what we see here is, this is a particular review around opioids and treatments for helping to get people off opioids. You probably don't want to see a whole bunch of reds, and you probably don't want to see a whole bunch of red anywhere. And here we see we're drowning in red. And if you look at, in terms of the coalface, we're one of two centres in Canada that do systematic reviews for the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Healthcare. And here is something on breast cancer from December of last year. And what we see is that for women 40 to 49, there's low certainty of evidence. It's exactly the same, even worse for women of 50 to 59. And one of the ways to interpret this is that actually the quality of evidence is bad. It's not good. And so that's at the coalface, that's at the trenches, that impacts what Frank was getting at, patients. And so if you look at the Cochrane Library, for example, you see authors, and here's simply two examples, and I could give you 52 examples. Authors are sort of saying that because the quality of reporting is so bad, we actually are unable to use most of the studies. We're unable to synthesize that. And that's bad science. It's highly problematic in terms of research integrity, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at the Lancet series from 2014, it sort of brings all of this together. And I think this really sort of made me think much more strongly about this continuation of bad science, of bad reporting, of problematic reporting. And sort of given this mess, why are researchers and how are researchers able to advance their careers? Which is, what I've shown you, I hope that you will realize and agree with that it's sort of detrimental research practices. And it has something to do with sort of perverse incentives and rewards within academic institutions. And so what we did is we used the Leiden Manifesto, and we looked at 170 medical schools and schools of health sciences around the world. And we looked really at 12 criteria. 5 of those criteria we really thought are quite traditional. I think most people in this audience would agree that journal impact factor is what we all worship in academic institutions. And if we think of something progressive, we might think of something like data sharing. And what we found is when we looked at that, we found that most of the criteria for promotion and tenure were traditional. Very, very little about progressive criteria used. And why might that be important? Well, it's important because there is evidence that researchers will tailor their publication practices and their behavior in order to advance their careers. And that's smart. Researchers are smart. And so where are the sort of levers of power and in sort of science? And we know that journals are important, funders are important, patients are important, citizens are important, and universities and other research institutions are also important because they're the home of current and future researchers. So it might be a place where we can imprint better behavior. And certainly Frank and others have written about this, the uneasiness of the system currently in place. In early this year, I think the provost of the University of Ghent sort of said we've got to change the system. And as Frank mentioned, there's DORA and there's lots of other initiatives. And I thank Anne-Marie Corriette for this slide. This is quite a packed place. There's lots of initiatives going on. But in the background of this, we decided to work on the Hong Kong Manifesto, which many of you have seen. And I'd like to sort of reinforce Lex's comment. Thank you all for those who provided some feedback, a lot of feedback, and is much appreciated. So what is the Hong Kong Manifesto? It's 5 principles. They're focused on issues of research assessment that strengthen research integrity. It concentrates primarily on what universities can do to modify promotion and tenure committees for career assessment. Implementation is a key. I think lots of people say we should do A, B, and C, but how would we implement it if we're going to make that happen at the coalface? And also we need to integrate evaluation, as one of the questions earlier was, how would you evaluate it? And it's an incredibly important issue. So here are the principles. I'm not going to read them for you. You're all able to read. And they're on the website of the World Congress of Research Integrity. And let me share with you some of the rationale for some of the principles. So for principle number 3, which is value the practice of open science, what could we think about? So we could think about using the credit system in terms of trying to be very transparent about what did people do in a research publication? How did they participate? And that's increasingly important given the complexity of research. And also data sharing would also be sort of an example of openness that Frank has spoken to. And then if we think about, okay, well, how would we implement some of these issues? So if you look at principle 2 is value the reporting of all research, regardless of the results, and reward honest and transparent reporting. So here's an example that Doug Altman and I worked on, a declaration of transparency. And here you see that at least in one journal, BMJ, they actually have implemented this. And this could be implemented at a university as well, and there are many reasons why you might want to implement a declaration of transparency. It may strengthen research integrity, for researchers. So anything that we do in terms of the Hong Kong Manifesto, if possible, we want to use evidence to drive the change, particularly around promotion and tenure. So later on this afternoon, we're going to have a focus track session, and then tomorrow, as Lex mentioned, we're going to have another focus track session. And what we want to use these focus track sessions for is to sort of build a data bank of implementation. So Frank has given us a very nice example of implementation within one university. And so we need to build up a data bank of implementation strategies that courageous promotion and tenure committees will use, that they will sort of see this as, in a sense, a menu of how we could move forward. I want to give you an example of a strategy that's failed, because I think we need examples of success and failure, because failure in one situation may be a success in another. So here's a preprint, and here's a people that looked at a journal, Psychological Science, and they looked at 27 publications that had a registration. And what they found is that despite registration in this journal, despite getting badges for registration, that there was deviation from registration, from the plan in the registration in every single case. So that's a problem, but that may be a problem worth looking at that could be turned from a failure to a success in an institutional setting or perhaps in a different type of journal setting. We also need to really think about, and I know there's work going on, how can we experiment with CVs? And so one thing that I've been sort of thinking about is, could we have a CV for the 21st century? Could we have a competition in universities? We could get some young people to use GitHub and sort of try to pull all this information together from a CV. So all of the information on an article or whatever it is, it could be something completely different, that could be collected very easily and could be transmitted not only to the researcher, but it could be transmitted to promotion and tenure committee. So you could see something like a trial tracker, which is an ability to see whether trials are being reported in institutions. You could adapt that to see what's going on with researchers within an institution. So you could use really audit and feedback. So you could use implementation science here. If you want promotion and tenure committees to change, you're going to have to help them in some way. And I think we need to make CVs more electronic, more useful, and more friendly to capture information that is progressive in terms of criteria to assess people. And so I wanted just to share with you, here's an example of implementation science for audit and feedback. And audit and feedback might be very, very useful for promotion and tenure committees to have. And what we could do is develop a toolkit for universities, for journals, and funders, where we would have examples of success and failures to implement change. We could have standard operating procedures to implement modifications for promotion and tenure criteria. So if we want to move away from journal impact factor and we want to use data sharing, we need to help people in promotion and tenure committees. How would they implement that? Because they don't know how to do that. They're busy people. So we need to be able to provide them with that help. And also, we need to think about how to evaluate any change that goes on, because there's no point in having change if it's not effective in a direction that we think is important. That said, I do want to point out that there are risks to implementing any change to promotion and tenure committees, whether it's the Hong Kong Manifesto or not. So, for example, in universities that do implement the Hong Kong Manifesto, for people at those universities, they may be seen, if they go to another university that doesn't implement it, they may be perceived as less competitive. They don't have Frank's all-important Nature Cell science paper. They may have something else which is equally important but not valued by those institutions. I think almost all change will involve some sort of costs. And Frank had mentioned FAIR as an example of trying to implement data sharing. That can't be done overnight. It will take effort to do, and it will take some cost to do, just the same way as it takes money for an APC into a journal. It takes money to make data, code, materials available. We need to be realistic about that as well. And some institutions may be quite conservative, and they may prefer a stepwise approach to how to implement this, and they may not want to do it all in one go, and I think that that's fine. But I do think that in the end, the benefits of implementing the Hong Kong Manifesto will outweigh the risks, and I think it will also strengthen research integrity, which is very important. And I know that I wasn't around this morning, but I do want to mention this, as I think it's a very important point. That as I said, that people do respond to incentives, and I think we need to move away from perverse incentives and rewards to thinking about ones that are more progressive and are more in line with sort of societal needs, and we can move in that direction, and I think we need to move in that direction. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David, for this enlightening talk. This is the start of the further development of this Hong Kong Manifesto. So please go to the microphone again if you have any questions. And while you're doing so, you're already there. Frits Roosendaal, please go ahead.
I was very close, not that I'm fast. Frits Roosendaal, Leiden, the Netherlands. I was wondering, both you and Dr. Miedema talked about the credibility cycle. There's money there and recognition, and you focus on recognition and not on money. Would the new system also lead to a more balanced distribution of research funding, which now seems to go large heaps to a few professors who publish in Cell and Nature? They've been called Professor Dagobert, like Dagobert Duck, and small amounts to the rest of the scientists. So do you think a new system will also lead to a redistribution of funds?
I think that may vary by institution. I think all institutions will not value the same things, and I think that may be quite reasonable. I think we ought to value issues like data sharing. We ought to value it a lot. And of course, research funding, I think we would be naive to think that research funding and journal impact factors are going to go away. They're not going to go away. But I think, can we add, do we have something we can add to the system that we could put more weight in and actually downgrade the journal impact factor? We know, for example, that patients, at least in the context of clinical trials, that patients are very favorable to share data. And in the context of Canada, and I'm sure other countries, but certainly in the context of Canada, where we have invested a tremendous amount of funding into the voice of the patient, it's very important to share data, particularly if they think it's a good idea, and there's a whole bunch of other reasons to share data.
Yuri Teining.
Thank you, David. My name is Yuri Teining from Amsterdam. Thank you for your beautiful talk, and I find it beautiful that you put so much effort in the implementation phase. However, I still am a little bit skeptical about the real implementation because it's so hard. My question comes, Lex, don't worry about it. It's just a short introduction.
Be quick.
Yeah. So my question is, how can you really implement it? How can you make sure that all the deans, all the rectors of all these universities that now are so dependent on the Shanghai Index, all those ranking indexes, how can we make sure that they are going to change? Because otherwise, we're just having a beautiful manifesto, and everyone here in this bubble is believing in this manifesto, but we have to change change the opinions of other people.
So I think it's going to be like most new things. There's sort of you're going to have the early adopters. You're going to have people later on. I think we have to make this the normative. So we have to make issues like data sharing as one example, as something normal. I think we need to go to the deans and the rectors that are more progressive, who may be interested in trying to implement change. I think, more broadly speaking, is we have to help them. So there's no point in having change if we can't help them, and we have to think of ways that we can help them.
Yeah. May I suggest that?
It's not your turn.
Oh, no,
it's not your turn.
Frank, I was still.
No,
please,
can
I?
Please, you can line up there, but the lady was first.
Yeah. Can I?
No. Please.
Can't I make a suggestion? No, my suggestion.
One question.
Sorry, I'm going to change the topic. My name is Judith de Schuur. I work as a statistician in Amsterdam. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on registered reports, because they provide a means to peer review protocols, power analyses, and they are, in my head, a good way to improve on the low power and the red grading of trials. What are your thoughts on it, and why do you think why is it not that big yet in medical science? So
I think your question is a good question. Registration, seems to me, would be incredibly important as a progressive criteria to use in promotion and tenure. We know, if you look at the Cochrane Library from November of 2018, Bobby Scherer has sort of followed a cohort of studies over a long period of time. And in 2007, publication bias was estimated to be 37%. In 2014, which I think is the last update, or 2016, it was estimated to be 44%. So it's increasing. Publication bias is increasing, and that's got to change. So registered reports are certainly more common in psychology. They are entering the marketplace in healthcare. But if you look at psychological science as an example, the slide that I put up, which is not dissimilar to registered reports, there's been a failure. So the point is that it's not good enough to implement something. You need to see, is it adhered to? So a journal could say, I'm going to endorse Consort as a reporting guideline. Simple to do. A journal could say, I'm going to implement Consort. More difficult to do, but how are they going to adhere to that? So we need to get promotion and tenure committees. How will they adhere to change?
Frank.
So we can go back to Judy's question. And Judy is a psychiatrist, so you know that. So no. For deans and for rectors, this is really, really difficult. I explained it. But as soon as funders, major funders, say to us, to deans and rectors, you have to comply with this and this rule, they'll do it. Because we need the money. It's oxygen.
Right. So if I can just give you, to follow up an example from the lady before you, who was talking, in a sense, about registration. I picked up a tweet that is in my next set of slides, that the NIHR now will implement a strategy that researchers cannot apply for new funding without showing registration and showing what's happened with that registration. So that's an implementation strategy which is very important. The question is how will NIHR and any other agency or university promotion and tenure committee, how will they adhere to that strategy? How will they make sure that adherence is taking place?
Second opportunity, Yuri.
Yeah. No, well, I have to formulate it into a question. Cannot it be a good suggestion that...
This is clever, this is clever.
To have you as academic leaders, you are the leaders, you are the early adapters, and we need you from the young researchers' perspective. We need you to aspire this message, not only here in this conference, but also in the cancer research conferences, also in the immunology conferences, that we need, in keynote lecture, because that's where we need to change this system. Not here. I mean, here we are believers, but we need other believers as well from these parts.
You can be our first ambassador.
Yeah. I'll do my best in the next psychiatry conference.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you again, David. Thank you so much.